there's a question that I'd like you to ponder. And it's the question of what's the product of testing? If anyone's in the business of being paid to provide testing services in one way or another, then you really ought to have an answer to this question. And I would imagine that should be most people in the room. After all, you might say, well, testing's an activity, it's a service, it's not a product, so why should there be a product? Well, if the service or the activity of testing is to be a valuable and productive service, then there should be a valuable product that is the result of it. And if, in considering this question, the answer that's sort of in your head at the moment is the word quality, then I'd ask you to think again. Maybe you're influenced by the fact that my talk is visualizing quality, but I don't think quality is the answer to this question. After all, what we are in the business of is providing answers, providing evidence to people who need to make a decision. And what I believe the thing we produce is confidence to the people that need to make those decisions. So let's be clear, when I talk about testing providing confidence, it's not necessarily confidence in the thing under test. Because we're still doing a good job if we conclude that that thing doesn't hold water, that doesn't pass the test. We've still provided good and valuable testing if that allows someone to make the correct decision to say, no, we don't go live with this, we don't release. So what we're doing is always providing our stakeholders with greater confidence in their decisions to make a go or no-go decision. Whether that's a sort of big, end of Big Bang release, or whether that's sort of micro decisions about releasing multiple times a day. These are still questions that the business need to answer, and what we do is we provide confidence in those decisions or those choices that they make. Now, it is important to note too that every time a stakeholder is making a decision like this, it's always got to be on the basis of balancing risk versus reward. So don't let yourselves get into a situation where you're responsible for quality, you're responsible for preventing things going wrong. Because if you only have that side of the equation, well, to be honest, if your job was to avoid risk, you would always say no. It seems that every generation, maybe even every decade, we have our iconic images of tragedy and suffering that define that age. For me, growing up in the 1980s, it was the image of the Challenger disaster that sort of burnt itself into my consciousness. I was around 19 at the time, and I watched that launch live on TV, so I saw this terrible event unfold as it happened. It's now a matter of record that we know that the cause of that failure was the failure of the very large O-rings that seal the huge components of the solid rocket motor were too cold to do their job, basically. The unseasonably cold temperature in Florida on that January morning meant that the O-rings didn't do their job. Hot gases escaped, causing the explosion, and 7 astronauts died. Now, you could take the view of, well, this is an incredibly risky business, space travel. The shuttle and its launching rocket are incredibly complex components with millions of parts that could go wrong, and this happened to be the thing that went wrong on this day, and we couldn't have predicted that. It was a tragic accident that was not able to be predicted. Well, you know that it's the O-rings that failed on that day. What you might not know is that the night before there was a pre-launch meeting, effectively the NASA equivalent of a go, no-go or release decision, where there was really only one item on the agenda, and that was this question. Are the O-rings going to suffer a catastrophic failure tomorrow due to the cold temperature? So exactly the situation that unfolded is what they debated the night before. And those who are familiar with this story might find that, might adopt the somewhat conventional position that this was a classic example of, well, look, the engineers told you that this risk occurred. The engineers told you that this was going to happen, and the money-driven management refused to accept that and went ahead and launched, and 7 people perished as a result. I found that when I looked into this, it wasn't actually quite that straightforward. It wasn't really so cut and dried. The nature of that pre-launch meeting can only be described as it was like the conference call from hell. It involved about 30 people, I think in 3 different locations. There was no technology that allowed people to do any kind of screen sharing or anything that we might take for granted these days. Instead, a 12-page document was faxed to the 3 different offices, and people had to flip through their printed copies while there was a rather scratchy sounding voices on the telephones over the course of this 3-hour meeting. So here's the cover page of that fax. We all know how bad conference calls can get, but I hope none of us is ever in a situation where we're having to contemplate a decision as critical as this one. Now, the detail clearly is not something I want you to read, but I just want you to get a little bit of a sense of what that information looked like. So it was a mix of typed information. There was some handwritten information. It was essentially cobbled together, if that's not too harsh a term, from a number of different individuals that were each presenting what is effectively raw test data. So it was the engineers trying to gather all the information they considered to be relevant to this point that was being discussed, but it was a bit of a hodgepodge of information. Now, admittedly, these are rocket scientists, so you'd expect them to deal a little better with technical information than the average audience, but nevertheless, it wasn't exactly presented in the best way. This particular slide I'm showing here is arguably the only one that really shows some kind of correlation between decreasing temperature in this case and a particular important property of the O-rings. In this case, it's a value that represents something called shore hardness, which is essentially how squidgy or how firm is the O-ring at different temperatures. And they need to be soft and malleable because they need to sit into their position when great big pieces of metal are moving around them. But even on this, there's nothing that shows, well, what's the cutoff point? What's a dangerous level of shore hardness and what's a safe level? So even that isn't evident in this particular slide. So it went on, as I say, there was a dozen or so pages that were like this, all of which is the equivalent of us presenting raw test data, because it was an equivalent of data from previous launches and also data from test launches. Now, it did include a set of recommendations, and quite specific recommendations, to be fair. So they were saying, well, the O-ring temperature must be at least 53 degrees Fahrenheit at launch. And then it goes on to say, we recommend that you project the ambient conditions of temperature and wind to determine launch time. So essentially the engineers were saying, don't predefine what the launch time should be. You need to sort of check the weather conditions and wait until it's at least 53 degrees before launching. Story has it that at that point, a NASA manager shouted down the line, "My God, Thiokol, when do you want me to delay this to? July?" Now, the temperature the next day was predicted to be 20 degrees lower, by the way, which is why NASA sort of said, well, how long are we really prepared to wait to delay this launch? So there was this rather difficult moment where the NASA management said, well, okay, we've heard the engineer's opinion. Now, addressing Morton Thiokol, who were the contractors who were responsible for the solid rocket motor, NASA said, okay, we've heard the engineering opinion, you now need to make a management decision. And reading between the lines, some people say, well, this was essentially NASA leaning on Thiokol politically and commercially by saying, well, there is only one answer we really want to hear. You go away and think again about what it is you're telling us. And so about 3 hours after the original meeting came this one-page addendum to the facts, and this was sort of Morton Thiokol's management summary of what they'd just been told. And it's interesting because it goes from sort of summarizing exactly what the engineers had said, which is this first point. Calculations show that the SRM-25, that was the solid rocket motor that was being launched, the O-rings will be 20 degrees colder than solid rocket motor 15, where 15 was the last successful test they'd done. But then it sort of gets watered down as it goes further. So temperature data not conclusive on predicting primary O-ring blow-by. The engineering assessment is that colder O-rings will have increased effective durometer, that is, they'll be harder. If they're harder, they'll take longer to seat and more gas might go past. But then it says an interesting thing here. If the primary seal does not seat, so there's a pair of O-rings, a primary one and a secondary one. If the primary seal doesn't seat, the secondary seal will seat. A pretty extraordinary conclusion there. Basically saying, well, we've got a backup. And so the final conclusion is, yeah, we recommend that you launch, it'll probably be okay. Of course, history knows that it wasn't. The purpose of telling this rather sad story is that there's this interesting conclusion that came out of the presidential committee that investigated this disaster. And so I've included this quote from William Rogers. So where he says, failures in communication resulted in a decision to launch that was based on incomplete and sometimes misleading information. And here's the important line. It was a conflict between engineering data and management judgments. A conflict between engineering data and management judgments. And that really is the heart of what I want to inspire you to fix here. So I hope none of us are ever in a situation where the data that we provide is as critical as this. But turn it into your own context. Think about the information you provide and the management judgments that have to be made from it. It's possible that the engineers just thought, well, it's self-evident. We've got all this data we've been telling you, and you're just not getting it. Maybe the engineers were so embedded, so living and breathing this data and these tests for months and years that it was very hard to articulate to people who are not embedded to see what they were seeing. But at the end of the day, what they failed to do is to recognize that the criticality of this decision meant that it was worth investing much more into the presentation and the legibility, the understandability of the data that they were providing. So think about the relationship between how we understand and how we perceive things. If you think about the phrase we use when we get a point, when we finally understand something, we say, I see. And it's not accidental. The connection between the visual sense and our belief is incredibly deep. There's the old phrase of seeing is believing, but it's also that, well, seeing is understanding. And we know this because we know how easy it is to be fooled by optical illusions. Our brain gives the visual sense so much greater priority over everything else that we probably shouldn't be trusting our eyes quite as often as we do. So to demonstrate that, I'm going to involve you in something that ideally ought to lift the mood a little bit too, because I've given you a very sad story. Now it's time to raise your spirits a little bit. So I'm starting up a boy band. Okay, I've tracked down Lady Gaga's cousins, and they're three identical triplets. They're called Viscount Vava, Dr. Dada, and Baron Baba. And we've got a little song together. It's pretty basic, but we think this is going to be their hit. Now, what I need is for you to be their fans, okay? So I'm going to divide the audience up. I think we've got a full house here, so this should work. So let's do it according to the way it is on the screen. So if I divide everyone who's maybe from about where I'm standing here to my right, you're going to be Viscount Vava's fans, okay? So when you hear Viscount Vava singing his thing, you kind of need to go crazy and cheer. From that point to maybe this point in the stage, you're going to be Dr. Dada's fans, okay? So the middle section, you're heavily into Dr. Dada, and everyone else to my left, you're into Baron Baba, okay? Now the difficulty is, these guys are identical triplets. You can't tell them apart. They all look exactly the same. They've got the same bad haircut and everything. But they sing different lyrics, okay? So Baron Baba sings ba ba, ba ba, ba ba. Dr. Dada sings da da, da da, da da. Okay, and you guessed it, Viscount Vava sings va va, va va, va va. Okay? So here's the thing, when you hear your guy singing, you have to go, way, and cheer, all right? Got it? Easy. And we call them the McGurk effect, by the way.
Ba ba, ba ba, ba ba. Ba ba, ba ba, ba ba. Ba ba, ba ba, ba ba.
Give it up for Dr. Dada.
Ba ba, ba ba, ba ba. Ba ba, ba ba, ba ba. Ba ba, ba ba, ba ba.
Now they're all going to sing together. See how this goes.
Ba ba, ba ba. Ba ba, ba ba, ba ba.
Close your eyes.
Ba ba, ba ba.
Open your eyes.
Ba ba. Ba ba, ba ba.
Weird, isn't it?
Ba ba.
You literally hear the sound that you see, but it's exactly the same sound. If you don't believe me, I can play that again, but you can watch this afterwards, okay? The only sound you heard was ba, 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 ba. But as soon as you see the lip movements that simulate a d, d sound, if you see the tongue going off the palate, you think, well, you're seeing d, d, da, da. And that's what you hear. As soon as you see the lips going v, v, the teeth over the lips, making a v sound, or appearing to make a v sound, you hear the v sound. When in fact, you close your eyes and you realize none of those sounds are being made. It's just ba, ba every time. Pretty incredible effect. Okay, so beware of this. Like I say, the brain will prioritize what it sees over what it hears. And we need to be conscious of that syndrome in anything that we present. If we've got visual information and we've got written information, people will believe the visual information first if those two things are in conflict. Okay, so I want to give you a fairly quick tour through things that one needs to consider in the act of visualizing data, in particular data associated with quality, but data of any kind, really. And the first is that we should always be putting data in context. Okay, let's take a raw figure. I've chosen, this is 2008 figures, but it turns out that this is actually fairly consistent with what things are now, but this is the US annual military budget, $607 billion US dollars. That's 1 year's US military spending. Now, it's such a big number that it's it's kind of difficult to process. None of us have ever had $1 billion in our pocket, so you don't really know, you can't really even work out how much that is. We know it's big, but how big? Well, we could compare it to what are the budgets of other countries, okay? China and the UK are sort of second and third, they're about 1/10 of that. Or look at it another way, that budget is greater than the next 10 countries combined. Or maybe you want to compare that to how might that money otherwise be spent? Well, roughly 5 months of US military spending would wipe out the entire continental debt of Africa. So, but here's the thing. America is a rich country. It's actually got a lot of money to spend. We might think it's obscene that it spends that much on the military when there's all these other things it could do, but it also needs to be taken in the context of its capacity to spend. And when you say, all right, let's divide the military budget or represent it as a percentage of that nation's gross domestic product or GDP, then the figures come out a bit different. So Myanmar jumps to the top of the table at 26%, and the USA is now in 8th place. Only 4% of their GDP is actually spent on the military. And the UK is sort of a humble 2%, which is the thing that annoys Donald Trump at the moment because he wants everyone else to be spending a bit more. So that's similar, if you like, to often the way we represent defect data. My friend and fellow keynote speaker who's speaking tomorrow, Paul Gerard, he has a nice phrase that says, well, you know, reporting defects is a little bit like a body count. You know, it doesn't really tell you anything about the progress of, you know, a strategy to win hearts and minds. Anyway, so we know that if we just said, here's how many defects we found in our system, that's kind of the equivalent of the raw number of the military budget. It would be better to say, well, okay, how is that in the context of how much code there is that's under test? So maybe we can say, what's the defect density in terms of 1,000 lines of code or function points or whatever might be the measure you use for that volume. So that's an improvement, but people will still want to know, well, is that good or bad? How do I know? Is 32.1, you know, sensible? Is that adequate? So maybe we could say, well, how does that compare against other releases we've done in the past? How does that compare against our competition? How does that compare against sort of what's held up as best in class in the industry? So that might be a better way to say, here's where we sit relative to other organizations. Visualizing is also about being able to reveal the unseen. It's about what is the thing that your data wants to tell you that you don't otherwise have a means of seeing. This is a really fabulous example, and I could spend all day on this, so I need to be a little bit careful, but it's often cited as the original infographic. It's in terms of the sorts of thing that we're used to seeing in newspapers and magazines and the Economist and so forth. This was kind of considered the first example of what we take for granted now as a modern infographic, and it was pretty revolutionary of its time. So it was created by a guy called Charles Minard, and it represents the essentially the size of Napoleon's army in the invasion and subsequent retreat of Moscow. And the way to parse this is, so it's the brown line is the invasion, the march towards Moscow. The black line is the retreat. And it's sort of, I know you can't see the details, but it's roughly on a map. So there are place names. So I think that represents Vilnius, and there's Polotsk, and obviously there's Moscow there. So it generally shows the path that the army followed on its route to Moscow. But the width of the line is the size of the army. So there are varying accounts. Some people say it was 600,000 strong. Minard went with 422,000. And so that's the width of this brown line at this point where the army is crossing the river Neman. And obviously it gets thinner and thinner as the army is suffering attrition from Russians and from basically the horrendous weather. Which is also represented by this rather neat extra bit on the bottom. Here he's plotting on the retreat in 1813, the average temperatures at each of these points. So it ranges from things like -11 to -30. So yes, it was the horrendous weather thinned out the army considerably. So a pretty remarkable insight to have someone represent so much data in one quite terse visual representation. Here's another one that I quite like. I'm not a football follower, so when I first came across these sort of footballer heat maps, I thought, oh wow, that's a fantastic idea. Others might be pretty familiar with them already. And it essentially shows what were a player's movements during a match, and it does so in what I think is a quite neat, intuitive way. So obviously the darker the red on the football pitch map shows where that particular player, in this case Theo Walcott, how much time they spent in that area during this match here between Arsenal and Barcelona. And so you can see that he's obviously a winger, he's spending most of his time attacking, and that's pretty much what you would expect for the role he plays. What I like about this is that it doesn't really need a whole lot of explanation. So even if you're not a footballer and even if you haven't seen one of these before, your brain gets this visualization pretty quickly because it has a nice sort of mental analogy. It's almost like I would look on the field and see where his boots have scuffed the grass, from where he's been running around. That's kind of what this is representing. Obviously, this is just taken from sophisticated IT data, but the representation is actually quite intuitive and quite natural for us. Here's another simple thing to do that doesn't involve anything particularly difficult, is visualize what the opinion of your product is in the marketplace now by polling social media. Look for your product name and look for the combination of that and a hashtag fail or something like that, or a sad face or something else that's going to be a giveaway that people aren't particularly happy with your product at the moment. I singled out HSBC for this example because they've got the worst internet banking ever, if you're listening, HSBC. Another thing that we can do is visualize or simplify large bodies of text. So one thing that I think is worth doing is to say, given what we say about our product in our system documentation, or indeed in our user documentation, just create a word cloud out of that. Get a sense of what are the main things that we're talking about when we describe our product. And then compare that to anything that's representing our tests of that. So things like, if you're using Cucumber, you could pump your feature files into this. And so do a comparison of whether the things we're mentioning in our tests are consistent with the things we mention in terms of our system documentation. Okay, another important consideration is the matter of scale. So anyone who's been to London will recognize this rather iconic image. It's of course the London Underground or tube map. And it's considered a great example of good design because it's not attempting to be geographically accurate, it's constrained. So every line can bend at no more than 45 degrees, and that results in a fairly elegant, nicely spaced out design, and also means you can, the way it's been organized, the tube stop names are all fairly clear and nicely spaced out. The trouble is, this map is so useful and so heavily used by anyone who's a tourist in London, is that it becomes your mental model of the shape of London. And you tend to think that this is the map, because this is the thing that you're relying on if you're traveling around by tube. And so, to pick an example, you might say, well, let's say I've arrived at Paddington and I want to get across into the City of London at Bank. Maybe the thing to do would be to go down the Circle Line, change at Notting Hill, and take the Central Line in, or maybe I could go this other way around. Now, if we repurpose this or re-represent this in terms of an actual geographically accurate map, then it looks quite different. So this is the actual map of London with the tube maps included. And here we can see that if I arrived at Paddington, I don't really want to go west a couple of stops only to come back to roughly the same spot. It's a very short walk from Paddington to Lancaster Gate, and anyone who knows their way around London knows that trick and always walks to Lancaster Gate from Paddington, carries on eastward from there. So we've got a similar problem with the real map. You know, okay, here we're thinking, yeah, but this is the actual map. What's wrong with this? Well, this, of course, is known as the Mercator Projection. And although we take it for granted that that's what the map of the world looks like, it's just one attempt to solve the problem of how do I take a spherical globe and represent that on a flat piece of paper. And what Mercator did was say, well, I need a map for people who are sort of traveling by sea. So the Mercator projection says I could take any 2 points on the map and draw a straight line on them, and if I worked out my bearing, my course from that in terms of the what direction I'm going, I will end up at the correct destination. Therefore, it's useful for people traveling by sea. But therefore, it distorts the actual land area. So I think it's known as, yes, the Peters projection is an alternative that shows the countries of the world the size they actually are. And so we fix problems that might have been in our head, like we thought Greenland was the same size as South America. In fact, it was 1/7 of the size. You know, Australia is pretty much the same size as America, which always surprises Americans. Doesn't surprise Australians. Africa is sort of vastly bigger than most people actually give it credit for. So this is, we need to be careful about where we've optimized one representation for one purpose. That's good, that's what we should do if that is our purpose, but be aware of reusing that same visualization for a different purpose might lead to misleading results or misleading information. Also on the issue of scale is this topic of the American Electoral Map. Oh boy, remember when American presidents looked and sounded like this? Anyway, so when Barack Obama was making his re-election speech in 2012, he had this lovely line. He says, "We are not as divided as our politics suggest. We remain more than a collection of red states and blue states. We are the United States." And of course, he was referring to the Electoral College map, which sort of shows during the course of the election which states have gone to the Democrats or which have gone to the Republicans. And therefore, it's useful for that purpose because that's the way the American electoral system works. So it's accurate in that sense. But it's not accurate for saying, well, you know, how Republican is this particular state? You know, we believe from this that, you know, California is Democrat and always has been, Texas is Republican and always has been, and that's, you know, that's all there is to it. Of course, the problem with this is, you know, the land doesn't vote, people vote, and people aren't sort of equally spread across the land. So a useful device here is known as a cartogram. So that's where you skew or adjust the shape of a map according to some property, in this case by population. So here we see things like, you know, California and the New England or Northeast states swell in size because they're densely populated, and you know the heart of the country, the Midwest and so forth, shrink because that's fairly sparsely populated. And so that gives a better sense of why Obama won the election in that case. But once again, it's still not, you know, everyone in a particular state voting one way or another, even though that's the way the Electoral College results go. Here's a representative of how people voted according to the county in which they live. And on this view, it's a wonder that Obama got elected at all. It seems to be almost entirely red. But once again, we can turn that into a cartogram and we see that many counties, particularly around the coast, are more densely populated. But even then, it's never black and white. It's never an entire county one way or another. So what if we said, well, let's look at the proportion of how people voted. Let's, rather than treat them as red and blue, let's look at some purple, you know? And here we see that very few counties are heavily red or heavily blue, as you'd expect. Most places have people with opinions that go both ways. And I can turn that into a cartogram and then, you know, we no longer recognize the map of America terribly well, but at least we see the true nature of the complexity of how people vote in the country. And I think Obama's words are actually borne out by this, that it really is a much more complex picture than you might first assume. Here's another interesting representation of scale. This is known as the Penfield Homunculus. So what this is really, you could think of it as if we never saw ourselves in the mirror, this is the way we think the shape we think we would be. Because it's taking, it's essentially like a cartogram of the human body, where we scale the parts of the body according to how many nerve endings there are in either the sensory nerve cortex or the motor cortex. So sensory is obviously what we can feel and what we can sense. Motor is what we have control over. Now, as you'd expect, they look pretty similar, because it kind of makes sense that the most sensitive areas like your hands and lips are also the most dexterous. So you have high numbers of sensory nerves as well as motor nerves in the hands and fingers. I guess there is one notable exception. The gentleman in the audience might recognize there is a particular area that's quite sensitive, but over which we have no control at all. So how do we use this idea of scale in our own context? Well, I expect every one of you relies on some kind of system diagram in your in various representations of test coverage or whatever it might be. There's bound to be some standard system architecture diagram that you've used. But again, those are a bit like the London Tube map. They're optimized for a particular purpose, and they're not really drawn to any kind of scale. So you could start experimenting with how you scale your system diagrams by certain properties. You know, what do we think is, you know, the number of lines of code here? Maybe I could scale on that basis. Maybe I could scale by how often these functions are used. Maybe I scale them by the value to the business or the risk and so forth. So we could take a diagram like this, and then you'd probably find that sort of, you know, legacy mainframe that's sort of just surreptitiously put in the corner scales to something rather bigger like this. Okay, I'm going to, well, I'll go quickly into dangers, but I don't want to dwell too long on this, because my intent is to inspire you rather than to, you know, point out the things that can go wrong. But it is worth covering a few things that can go wrong. So one is what I would call this sort of arbitrary representation. So this is trying to show a visualization of a code base by representing things in three-dimensional space. The trouble is, unlike the heat map of the footballer, the brain doesn't really have anywhere to you know, align this. It takes time to learn what a visualization like this is telling you. Turns out that it's the footprint of each of these you know, buildings, if we want to call them that, is the size in lines of code, but I seriously have to look at it. The color is the complexity, and the height is the number of changes. Well, none of those things really correspond naturally in our heads to you know, seeing them in that way. So it's very hard to, you know, use that particular representation to make sense of it unless you spend a lot of time learning how to interpret that. And I think that rather defeats the purpose. Similarly, I think, you know, some tools will go overboard and you can get sort of crazy-ass dashboards like this. I don't think that's visualization, that's masturbation. Be aware also of this problem of color bias. So this is a real example from a client I was working with, where there was a fairly serious production issue that occurred, and, you know, we had been tracking automated test coverage through a visualization tool like this for a little while, and we thought, okay, here's a good way of testing. Does the fact that a bug slipped through, does that correspond with areas that weren't tested well enough? And so this was the large scale sort of representation of the code base, and we're saying, well, did the production error turn up in the red area? Well, no, it actually turned up in the area that was greenest on the map. And I say greenest, not green, because That's the problem, is that it looked green only because it was greener than the rest. But it was averaging out a very patchy coverage for that part of the code. So that, what we thought was green in the first place was only about 60% coverage and included some areas of very low coverage, and that's where the defect occurred in an untested part of that part of the code. And I guess here's another thing I think anyone who travels by aeroplane will be familiar with, is this problem of perspective and scale. You know, when I'm wanting to know where the plane is in terms of my progress between London and Oslo, well, saying I'm somewhere over the North Sea doesn't really give me a lot of information. Equally, if I'm on a journey from London to Oslo, I don't really need to know where I am in relation to Dar es Salaam, okay? So, you know, according to this, I could have just got on the back of the plane in Heathrow, walked to the front and stepped off in Oslo, wouldn't I? So, yeah, we want to find a scale that's sort of the happy balance of those things that actually provides a useful representation of progress. Okay, so that's enough about dangers. Let's move, therefore, okay, I've given you some ideas, I hope, for different ways that we can visualize data, different ways that information can be represented. What sort of things do we have at our disposal to help us do that? Well, this is clearly a very sparse list. I don't attempt to list all the useful tools that one can use for visualization, but I want to sort of touch on some reference points that should be familiar. And I've organized these such that there's things that are general purpose to the right, things that are more specialist or specific to a particular purpose to the left. And if it's lower down, it's low tech. If it's higher up, it's high tech. And again, these are all sort of very much generalizations. But okay, there in the bottom right corner is the whiteboard and whiteboard pens. And we shouldn't underestimate the value of this. I'm a great fan of the whiteboard. I like the power and flexibility that it gives me to say, I want to represent exactly the thing that matters at the moment, and not have, you know, any kind of thing getting in the way of me doing that. Because as soon as you try to introduce a tool, you're futzing around with the tool. You're not representing data. So it's by far the cheapest of the tools, and you know, lowest startup cost and so forth. But the final point on here is that your low-tech representations have an amazing quality. They encourage interaction and they encourage engagement. They encourage people to question and to improve. It's really quite extraordinary, but I've seen this, you know, bearing out over and over again. This picture here is with a client I was working with recently, where the team had a system diagram. It's this bottom right corner here, printed out and stuck at the bottom of their board. And it got ignored, you know, week after week. Nobody ever referred to it. Nobody ever looked at it. Nobody ever mentioned it. And then one day I said, all right, well, how about we just draw a picture of the subset of that architecture diagram that shows the stuff that is nearest to what we need to build, and we'll sort of start, you know, adding in the bits that we need to build. And it was a pretty quickly, you know, sketched up diagram, but it was on a big sheet of A1 Magic Whiteboard. And this was literally the first day that went up. The product owner is immediately saying, okay guys, this is what we need to do, and we're going to change this bit here. So he was immediately interacting with it, and people were listening, and it was extraordinary how quickly that resulted in people engaging with that as a visual representation of the work that they needed to do. And I would argue it was the low-tech nature that did that. The printed version, it's too easy to ignore. Nobody wants to change something that's just a printout. Whereas if you've got the original, if you've got the whiteboard sketch, people know it's temporary. People know that this is something that we can fix and improve. I don't need to say too much about Kanban boards. I'm sure most of you are using some kind of variants of these. The important tip is that I always make sure that we identify what people are doing, so always represent people on your Kanban boards as well as tasks, so that you can see if people are overloaded, you can see if people have capacity. Anyone who was at my tutorial yesterday knows that I'm a big fan of story maps. I think they are a fantastic method of visualizing your backlog. And what I like about them is that they scale up and they scale down. You can create story maps for existing products. You can create story maps for products you're intending to build. You can do story maps for epics. You can do story maps for entire organizations. So it's a very simple two-dimensional representation, but an inherently versatile one. And again, this is not new. I'm sure many people in the room are familiar with this. This is James Bark's so-called Lowtech testing dashboard, where he suggests, create, again, just on a whiteboard probably, list the areas that you're testing and show a couple of important things. What's the level of test effort that's currently being subjected to this? What's the coverage like? And what's the tester's subjective opinion of the quality that they are seeing from their testing at the moment? I think that's a really important thing to show. If you think back to that sort of complex dashboard that we saw, all of that is kind of looking back. That's relying on data, on hard data. And quite often what you miss is the subjective opinion of testers, which really is the important thing you want managers and other stakeholders to be seeing live. So I think the great thing about this Lowtech dashboard is that it allows you to directly report that subjective assessment. So those are all sort of below the line. That is, those are all low-tech options. What about things that we might want to, might need a slightly more sophisticated tool to do? Well, the tool of choice, I think, for data scientists and people who are doing this for a living tends to be a product called Tableau. Again, I'm not affiliated with them, and clearly there are other tool choices out there, but it seems to be a good or a popular choice, at least, for people who do this a lot. It's essentially Excel on steroids, so it's designed to work with very large data sets, and it's got a number of different means for how you might connect to those data sets. But its main rationale is that you don't need to write any code, but there's a wide range of different styles of visualizations you can create from your data, and you can also connect things up. So you can essentially tell a story by transitioning from one visualization to another, and hence sort of have a more compelling story to tell with your data. It's well worth, although it's a commercial thing, there is a public version, well worth going and experimenting with that if you're keen to try it out. And then in the top right, that is the most general but also the most arguably high-tech, is that I think is worth checking out, is the thing known as the D3 library. So this is a JavaScript library called data-driven documents. It therefore, by its nature, does require code, but therefore you can roll your own representation with a vast array of potential styles for representing your data. So if you really want to create some specialist representation or a specialist dashboard, the D3 library is probably your go-to place. And then last on my list is good old Excel. It's somewhat maligned, but at the end of the day, it probably is the most common visualization tool that's in use today, if we're honest about it. So I'm going to give you just a few tips about this, because I think one of the problems with Excel is that it's very easy to create things quickly by using the defaults, but I think that doesn't necessarily lead to good visualization choices. So there's three different sort of classes of data representation: transitions, comparisons, and composition. If we consider transition to start, so let's say we're reporting how many defects, critical, high priority, medium priority, and low priority defects. If I have a table of that over time, and I just say, hit the graphing wizard button, it probably produces something like this. And this is a problem because this has got the most important things sitting on the top and the least important things sitting on the bottom. And I think that's bad because that means you don't get a real sense of whether we're improving or not. So it's always better to put your most important data items at the bottom and stack the others on top. So go from critical at the bottom to lowest at the top. Sorry, I think I've lost the mic. Hello? Okay. And also because it's a time series, it's better, rather than show that as columns, show that as stacked lines. Which I've just said. If I'm doing a comparison, let's say this is the number of defects in different parts of my system. Again, the standard thing tends to come out as a column chart. I find this problematic because typically the long names of the things I'm trying to identify either have to go vertically or on an angle like this, and that's not particularly easy on your reader. I would always recommend going with a horizontal bar chart for these sorts of things. It turns out the eye is actually better at comparing the difference in the length of those bars if they're horizontal than if they're vertical. So there we are. Trust the data scientists on that one. And then finally, if we're doing composition, that is, how is a particular thing composed of its parts? Again, a standard pie chart. This is typically what the default value comes out as. It takes, again, a lot of cognitive load to work out, what's going on in the legend versus what's going on in the pie chart. So the simple advice is do away with your legend, just annotate the pie chart itself in some way. And the other tip is don't have too many elements within your pie. It's recommended that there's no more than 7 elements, so anything lower than the 6th, just combine those things and say this is all the rest, or this is other. Okay. Now we're nearly at the end here. So these were my key points, and really this first one here is the important thing, is that whenever you sort of read anything about data science and visualization, you'll hear the word story come up a lot, okay? It's really about how do I make sure that there's a story that my data is telling? Because as we've heard from various sources of advice, people respond to the story. It's very hard to respond to raw data in itself, so you need to find a way to turn your data into a meaningful story. Okay, and some of the other summary points, okay, we said testing is not about creating quality, testing is about creating information that supports decisions. We need to be aware of how much our brain prioritizes what we see over what we hear, or indeed over what we read. Remember the McGurk effect experiment. Your eyes will be trusted even when they're being lied to. So you can, when you're choosing how you visualize, choose representations that already make use of what the brain would make sense of. Okay, so think in terms of things like the heat map. Find some kind of analogy in the way you're representing things. Don't just go for arbitrary representations because you think it's cool to have some kind of 3D representation of it. And it's also important to visualize your process as well as your product. So that's why I think big visible information radiators about how we're going, who's working on what. I think those are just as valuable as visualizations about the quality of the product that we're producing. So, okay, I've given you an idea of some of the tools that might support how you'd go about visualizing. I emphasize again, it's good to start low-tech. Don't be ashamed of sort of visualizing stuff just on whiteboard sketches as a starting point. But I thought I would leave you with something that provides a little bit of inspiration about what is possible, or what the professionals can do in the given the right amount of data.
For the questions, first one. Management like dashboards. What 3 things you definitely put on a test management dashboard?
I would definitely put subjective opinions. Okay, so don't allow the thing that's easy to report trump the things that's important to report. So if you're providing any kind of data for test management purposes, make sure testers' opinions of how they feel in their gut about the thing they're testing, make sure there's a way to include that. Well, that was one thing. 3, well, I like coverage assessments, but I like changes in coverage. So I would put how is our automated test coverage changing over time. So a raw test coverage figure is somewhat meaningless. It is useful to see how that changes over time. Okay.
No.
Is there a contradiction between beware of the McGurk effect and work with the brain? Well, working with the brain also means be aware of the tricks the brain might play. So the McGurk effect is about making sure that we don't say one thing and show another, because, as I say, we will always believe what we see rather than what we hear. So if we're able to show and say the same thing, then all good. But be aware of the risk. You know, the McGurk effect tells us to be aware of the risk of being lazy with the way we visualize things and spending too much time on what's written down or what's in the data, because the eye will always, revert to what it sees.